March 15th, 2023. Well, yesterday the Russians managed to engage in some interaction with one of our Reaper drones over the Black Sea, and apparently it was being harassed pretty intensely. And at least our side of the story is that the, one of the two Russian Su-27 fighter jets uh, must have clipped its propeller and caused it to crash. I find this a little hard to grasp, but that's what happened. I'm kind of wondering, was it more likely that the jet wash of these planes zooming by it threw it into an unstable flight path and it crashed? But if you look at a picture of one of them, I'll try to put a link to a picture in the description below. If you don't know exactly what they look like, I could easily see them hitting the tails easier than hitting the propeller. The only way I could see that could happen if they were coming around the back and the tip of the wing clipped the propeller, which I guess is possible. At any rate, prior to that, apparently they were dumping fuel on it and that sort of harassment, which I think the purpose was to fog up the optical sensors so they couldn't get the resolution they wanted on the targets that we were looking at. So, anyway, I guess that's a little bit of an escalatory step in the conflict. I mean, there's always we've done escalatory steps from time to time. Deploying HIMARS and then deploying various advanced types of artillery shells used with the 155 millimeter artillery pieces we've been sending them, and I think we even sent them some 105s. And now, of course, then the big issue a while back was the tank deliveries that are being processed at this point. So I guess the Russians have now responded with a little something of their own. Obviously, bringing down an unmanned drone doesn't lead to any American casualties, and so there'll be no. That would be a more escalatory step if they had taken a lethal step against our military, against the personnel. And so we're looking at measured activities. One thing I think one should bear in mind about this, though, is these are not innocent flights. These are reconnaissance flights trying to develop targeting data to allow the Ukrainians to launch potentially lethal attacks at targets that are killing their soldiers. So at some point, if you're engaged in a proxy war, the operative word there is war. And therefore, things like this are going to happen. And the question, of course, becomes how far we want to escalate it and how far it might escalate on its own accord if people lose escalation control. So at any rate, that's the latest development. I think the Hawks have got spun up about it. And so far, Obama's administration have kind of tried to downplay it a little bit as just extremely aggressive behavior. We have to remember, though, the Chinese has done a lot worse to us than that historically when they went after one of, I think it was a P-3 with a fighter plane and ended up causing it to land at one of their bases. And then they were able to go through and look at all of our sensitive equipment on it. So, let's bear this in context, or don't forget the Pueblo incident, where a whole ship was hijacked by the North Korean Navy, and members of the crew were even tortured. So, and held hostage for several times. So in the context of these things, let's bear in mind what level of badness this is, so to speak, and level of provocation that we're really engaged in at the same time. But anyhow, so if you like these videos, please give me a like, and we're looking for more subscriptions all the time. Because I want to try, give what I think an honest impression of these things are. So when we get into the issues there, I guess this sort of brings up the issue of the war itself, what's been happening since the last time. I guess I was a little premature with Bakhmut was right about to fall in the previous video I did on that. However, I would point out that it's still falling. I think it's moving a little slower, and I think what happened is that Zelensky, for political reasons, decided he wasn't going to agree with his military commander and fired him and appointed somebody else, and is ordering everybody to continue to fight in place and have sent in some reinforcements, at least to develop a line of defense. I'm not sure if how many have actually gone into the city, because the Russians are continuing to inch forward along most of the front. I mean, if you look at the data, I've been following day by day, piece by piece, they're taking one little piece after another. None of it's very dramatic. There's a lot of mud there now, so major, armored thrusts are, I think, kind of out of the question for the moment, probably. But because of the mud and the artillery and the landmines and the ambushes, and so what you got on both sides is just a, fairly high intensity combat. A lot of, artillery, particularly. And the thing is that, in the earlier part of the conflict, about a year ago, the Ukrainians were very innovative in the way they combined drones, even very small drones, with artillery to great effect. And then, of course, the famous Bayraktar TB2s and so forth. But now the Russians have pretty much joined the drone game in full force. And since they have more artillery, it's having its effect. So we'll have to wait and continue to follow this to see, how things evolve. Probably major moves probably won't happen until, I'm guessing, maybe May, whenever the muddy season is over and the ground solidifies enough that major armored maneuvers can happen. And of course, by that time, presumably many of the vaunted tanks that are coming in from Europe will have arrived, along with personnel that have been trained in European countries and in the United States, would presumably return to crew these vehicles and launch whatever this counteroffensive they're talking about is. The thing I find strange about this is that they had one of the key, I think, spokespeople, I believe was for Zelensky, was literally saying that when this offensive was going to happen, which was in May, which I guess everybody knows that, and we pretty much, I think, know where it's going to be either. They're going to try to chop the Russian land bridge in two. The problem is, of course, the Russians know this too. If we can be talking about it here, I mean, they all know about it, and they have significant reserves that are not yet committed to the front line. From what the information I've got, there's quite a bit of Russian military that's not on the front line right now. That's obviously being held in reserve for various contingencies, including that one. It's also other units are probably being held in reserve to exploit any kind of breakthrough if they eventually get one. So the struggle is ongoing, and of course, with this latest drone incident, we'll just have to wait and see, how that develops and what reaction the U.S. has and so forth. I mean, we could presumably start sending fighter jets to escort our drones to protect them. I mean, because in that case, it's very unlikely that they would want to directly engage our fighters in air-to-air combat at this point. I don't think they want to escalate to that level. And or I guess we just send another drone out and see what they do. Because one thing we don't know at this point, is this a strategic move designed to actually deny us the use of these drones in those international airspaces? Or is this simply a tactical maneuver to prevent that drone from seeing something that was going on at that moment that perhaps they were trying to cover, some operational maneuver that we were probably trying to, develop targeting data on and to hand off the Ukrainians, and they didn't want us to have that data at that moment because of whatever it was. I mean, these are the issues we just don't know the answer to yet, and we'll have to see. There's a lot of speculation that the way we handled the Chinese balloon incident could have had some impact on the Russian decision. I don't know. I think in any event, I think that the thing we continue to seem to be ignoring is we're fighting in Russia's backyard. And when the bear's backed up against the wall, the bear becomes kind of dangerous. And they can afford to take escalatory risks that we should see to be as imprudent. I mean, for instance, we could simply walk away from this whole thing pretty much and go home just like we did from Vietnam, like we've kind of done in Iraq, like we did in Afghanistan, and we'd still be secure over here. If Russia loses this, their regime perhaps will fall, and they might be willing to take drastic action to prevent that from occurring. And that's why I'm saying that this is a dangerous strategy, and I think that the best thing to do for everybody involved would be to try to negotiate an end to this conflict. Now, interestingly enough, the Chinese are now getting involved diplomatically. Allegedly, they're going to make, I guess, soon to make a trip, not allegedly, they're going to make a trip. Xi's going to go to Moscow to meet with Putin, and he's going to make a phone call to Zelensky. So he's going to try to play intermediary to try to negotiate some kind of a ceasefire, I guess, and begin negotiations. And notice that they've already intervened in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf to negotiate a resumption of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is kind of undermines a lot of effort we had against the Iranian nuclear program. So we've got a new player in the game too right now, and that's probably not one we want to gain that kind of influence. But we've sort of handed them this opportunity by refusing to negotiate with the Russians on terms that they could accept. Particularly, I emphasize, not so much now, but in the past. If we'd have done this, let's say last April or May, before the Russians were so committed to this thing as they are now, we probably could have got a settlement that would have preserved the bulk of the sovereignty of Ukraine and got the Russian military out of there. By being absolutely obstinate about this, they eventually went to levels of escalation that's going to make it much more difficult for them to back down from. And so we'll have to see how that again plays out and what China will do. So far, the Chinese efforts have been kind of dismissed by the U.S. and Europe, but interesting if Zelensky is interested in taking the call. So we'll see how that plays also. So at any rate, I guess I'll be kind of wrapping this up for now. I didn't get into the banking thing. I thought that's been much discussed, and I'll maybe hit that later if anything new happens on the banking situation. My general read on this is that, let's look at this objectively. Yeah, you can not like the idea that they're bailing out the depositors. I hope they're not bailing out the bank. That is to say, those people have totally messed up. But in terms of the depositors, if you let these banks fail and these people lose their money, the problem you have is that'll create more runs on other banks that are not as vulnerable. Even a financially stable bank can be destroyed by a run, even on a rumor, if it's carried out aggressively enough, if the run is quick and decisive. And of course, a bank with a lot of excessively wealthy people depositing there could become more vulnerable because they're probably quickly to make electronic wire transfers out of the bank, whereas the ordinary person might be a lot slower to act. So the key thing is to keep the banking system stable. Everybody can complain about the cost of a bailout. I can assure you the cost of a total meltdown would be a lot bigger. And that's what we have to avoid here at the moment. I mean, if we'd have bailed out Lehman back in 2008, we might have avoided hundreds of billions of dollars of bailout that followed suit afterwards. But since they let that go under, the dominoes started falling almost immediately. Anyway, that's just my view on that. It doesn't mean I like being in this situation. No, I don't like all the incredible Biden spending policies. I kind of attacked that in my last video, which didn't get a whole lot of views on that one. But you have to look at the situation based on where you are, not where you want to be. No, we didn't want to be in a situation like this, but unfortunately we are. And the question is, how do we get from where we are now to where we need to be? And that's the issue. Well, anyway, I'll also be posting this on Rumble as always, and of course the descriptions, the link to my social media accounts are in the description below, and like I said, I'll try to put a link to a picture of the Reaper drone just to see what I'm talking about the probability of actually just clipping the propeller.